An obvious way to learn Mandarin is to listen to someone who speaks the language. A less obvious way is to listen to the person who isn't speaking in a conversation. What can you learn by listening to the listener? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to share with you a trick for improving your Mandarin conversations, no matter what level you are on. As cognitively overloaded second language learners, we often spend all our time thinking about what we are saying in a conversation, or maybe what the other person is responding, but we rarely pay attention to what the person not holding the floor is saying. Even though your textbook, or indeed any kind of fiction, might lead you to believe that conversations are well ordered, where people take turns to speak and finish sentences, etc., this is not really how real conversations work, and the listener, or the person who's currently not the main speaker, usually says quite a lot of things to show that they are engaged and are still listening. And in other words, they are trying to be a good listener so the conversation flows. And this is often overlooked by language learners. As I said, we focus on what we say, we try to be fluent ourselves, and we want to make sure that our listening comprehension is up to par. But for a conversation to work smoothly, there are other things we need to do as well. You could imagine that if you told me the story of how you started learning Chinese, and I just stare at you the whole time without saying anything, this would be really awkward, and I'm not really being a good listener, which makes it harder for you to talk naturally, and the conversation as a whole will suffer. If I, on the other hand, insert short phrases, small words, or even noises to indicate that I'm listening, you will feel at ease, and the conversation will flow much better. I'm talking about things like saying 对 or 哦 or 真的吗 at the appropriate times. So this would mean right, or yeah, I see, or indicating some kind of surprise, or saying really. You probably know some of these words even if you started learning Chinese very recently. It's hard to listen to anyone speaking Chinese without hearing 对 all the time, for example. But there are many of these, and in this episode we're going to talk about this phenomenon, which is often called listener responses in linguistics. As I already mentioned, these are very common in natural conversations, but they might be lacking from textbook dialogues or any kind of scripted language. Some listener responses are common in many languages, and they might overlap in some cases between English and Mandarin, but this is not always the case, and there is a fair amount of research about this that I will also talk a little bit about in this episode. The best way to learn about listener responses, though, is not to read a dissertation or research article about this, or even to check the list in the written article on Hacking Chinese, but instead it is to listen to the listener. This is a kind of focused listening where you're listening with the aim of learning or collecting some kind of data that can help you learn or improve your Mandarin, not just to understand what people are saying. I have written about this before in an article called How to Improve Your Chinese Writing Ability Through Focused Reading, but exactly the same principles apply to improving your speaking ability through focused listening. As usual, I will put links to other articles and episodes in the show notes, and you can go to the written article on Hacking Chinese for full references. When you listen to the listener, it matters greatly what types of dialogues you are listening to. Because like I said, if you choose a textbook, most of these listener responses will be absent. I mean, people do say 对 and so on, but usually as the start of a response of some kind, not really something they insert between clauses as somebody else talks. Instead, you need unscripted language. So if you have a podcast for learners where they have written things in advance, this won't work. But if the people in the studio are talking about the dialogue or a story in Chinese and they haven't scripted this, then it works really well. Interviews of different kinds on radio or TV are great. Discussions and debates also work. Or maybe if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, you can just eavesdrop on people on the bus. So listening to this type of Chinese I think is normal. It's a part of what most people do at some point when they are studying. But what I'm talking about here is listening to the listener. So when you listen to that conversation, ignore what the person holding the floor is actually saying and listen to the listener. Listen to the other person. What are they saying to confirm? What are they saying to show that they are engaged and listening to the person speaking? It's easy to think that this is the same in different languages, but this is actually not the case, even though some expressions of, say, surprise tend to be rather similar sometimes. And in Mandarin and English, we have, for example, a rising pitch to indicate questions or surprise, and this is partly then cross-linguistic. There are some differences, however, and you can check the references on Hacking Chinese for more. But for example, in a study by Deng 2008, it was found that Mandarin speakers tended to use fewer listener responses in general, and that they also tend to insert them at boundaries in sentences rather than overlapping with the speaker. Still, this shouldn't be taken as an instruction to not use listener responses. I'm just trying to say that they are different and work somewhat differently in different languages. Using the listener responses you're used to from your language is unlikely to work perfectly in Mandarin, even though, like I said, some of them might of course work. The opposite can also be a problem, and this is something I think most advanced learners will have noticed. So if you have been listening to the listener and you have adopted a Chinese way of responding or showing that you are an active listener, and you then use this when speaking English, people will think that you are a little bit weird. For example, using to indicate that you listen and agree is extremely common in Mandarin, but it can come across as a grunt in English. I've even heard of cases where monolingual speakers of English ask what all this grunting is about. So now that we know that listener responses are important, let's have a closer look at different kinds of listener responses. These categories are of course a little bit arbitrary and they do overlap. And the goal is not to provide a taxonomy for future research, but rather to have some helpful categories to talk about. In the episode, I will mention a few examples, and there are a few more examples in the written article on Hacking Chinese. But like I said, the goal here is not that you should learn these from my list or from any of the research into this topic, but rather that you should listen to the listener, collect your own listener responses, and pay attention to how people listen, what they say when they are listening to somebody else. I've sorted the rest of the content for this episode into 9 categories. And so the first one is show that you are listening with the most common word in Mandarin. And it's quite funny that even though this word is so common, it is not in most textbooks. And it is the one I just mentioned earlier, which is so ubiquitous that most people don't even think about it. You can hear it dozens or even hundreds of times in a single conversation. Its key function is to show that you are listening while not stealing the floor. So you let the person speak, but you show that you are listening and also somewhat agree with what's being said. I should mention that for these listener responses we're talking about here, intonation matters a lot. So if you just change the tone here, it can come across as questioning or as a surprise, or if you have a more falling tone, it's more agreeing, etc. And this matters for all of these, so please be careful both when you listen and when you use these yourself. Number 2, acknowledge, confirm, and accept what has been said. So this is a more direct confirmation that you've understood and that you agree or accept what has been said. This is great to keep the conversation going, especially, for example, if somebody is giving you instructions. I'm talking about words like 对, 好, 是的, 没错, and so on. Number 3, let the speaker know you're eager to hear more. These phrases encourages the speaker to continue or expand on what they just said, and this is great for when people are telling you stories or explaining something. And in English we might say things and then, and what happened next, etc. In Mandarin you might say 然后呢, or 后来呢, or 结果呢, to show that you are interested in what happened next or what came out of that. Number 4, express admiration or an otherwise positive attitude. Whenever somebody tells you something interesting, fascinating, or awesome, it's good to be able to express that and show that you agree. You can do this by saying things like 太棒了 or 真厉害. This is a good opportunity to remind you that intonation matters here. So if you say that somebody is very 厉害 and you don't really think that, or you come across as not meaning it, it will sound sarcastic. So if you say this, it has to be something that is actually impressive and you want to express that. Number 5 is show surprise at or disbelief of new information. So these are sounds, words, and expressions that are used to indicate that something is new to you and you find it surprising or you disbelieve it in some way. The simplest one is probably o with different intonations like o, and things like that. But we also have phrases like 原来如此, so that's the case, or 这样啊, and so on. Of course, if you listen to native speakers, you will hear profanity of varying degrees here as well, but as a learner, I think it's good to stick to the milder ones. Number 6 is show empathy and sympathy when appropriate. So we just talked about what you do when somebody says something fascinating or interesting, but sometimes they might also share something which is sad or troubling or difficult in various ways, and it's also good then to be able to show sympathy. In this category, we have words and phrases like 哎呀 or 辛苦了 or 太惨了. Number 7, confirm understanding by echoing what was said. This is not really a fixed category of words or phrases, but rather the idea that by repeating something that the speaker said, you're showing that you're understanding and that you're following what they are saying. This can seem a little bit stupid when you write it down on paper or when you look at it explicitly, but it is rather common in natural conversations. So just to show you one example in English of what this might be, so if someone says, let's go to the market tomorrow morning, the other person might say, tomorrow morning, just to confirm that they've understood that or confirm that this is indeed when we're going to the market. Like I said, I can't really list words here because it obviously depends on what the other person is saying. This is excellent when receiving instructions because you can also confirm that you actually got it right. Number 8, signal engagement by trying to contribute to what's being said. As a listener, you can also show engagement by contributing to the conversation or what the other person is saying. For example, if they struggle to come up with the right word or pause for a bit, you can try to insert the word you think ought to go there. This doesn't steal the floor, but it still shows that you're interested and engaged, and even if you don't get the word right, it still has that effect. Although, of course, you need to be careful so you don't put words into other people's mouths that they didn't intend to say. This actually also works in reverse, so if you don't know what to say when you are speaking, you can leave this pause and let somebody else fill it for you. So essentially you're relying on that person using this listener response to help you figure out what to say. This is one of the strategies that David Moser described in his article How to Fake Sounding Like a Native Chinese Speaker, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And I will read an example here because it shows both how you can do this as a speaker, but it also, of course, like I said, works as a listener. So you say, and after being so rude, he didn't even apologize. Can you imagine that? The guy is such a... And then the other person just fills in. Jerk? And you continue, jerk, right. I was thinking to myself, boy, if I were that guy's girlfriend, I would really consider... And then the other person fills in, dumping him. And you continue, dumping the jerk, absolutely. The challenge with using this strategy as a listener is that you need to understand everything that was said and then also be good enough at Chinese to be able to supply something that is actually helpful. But when you succeed, this really shows that you've been paying attention. So, number 9, the final category is laugh when appropriate. So this is not really a language category, but laughing is important and there are some cultural aspects to this as well. So pay attention when people laugh. And of course, if somebody says something funny, you can laugh and that's good. It shows that you're listening and you got the joke. But then again, what is considered funny can sometimes be different. And people can laugh for other reasons than things being funny. So it's time to wrap up this episode. The best way to learn the sounds, words, and phrases that we have talked about here isn't to study the lists in the article on Hacking Chinese. They are there to give you examples. So don't copy them into your flashcard app and start reviewing. Instead, you should listen to the listener. Next time you listen to a conversation, pay attention to what the person not holding the floor is saying and see what you can learn from that. Simply paying attention to this overlooked side of a conversation will help you figure out how to do this well in Mandarin, and your conversations will be all the better for it. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.